Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Seafair webinar, Local Food Markets, Farm Labor and Metrics, Lessons from COVID-19. This webinar is brought to you by Seafair, the Council on Food, Agricultural and Resource Economics. It's also sponsored by the Agricultural and Applied Economics Association, NARA, and USDA. Today, we have three speakers. Dr. Cesar Escalante is a professor of agricultural and applied economics at the University of Georgia. Along with finance and agribusiness management, his research interests include immigration and farm labor, health economics, and microfinance. Our second presenter today is Dr. Lillian Brislin, the founding director of the Food Connection, a local food system center at the University of Kentucky. She pursues resilient and just food systems and studies the way food, farming, and the body interact. Ben Feldman serves as the executive director of the National Farmers Market Coalition, where he was previously policy director. He previously also worked at the Ecology Center and helped found the California Alliance of Farmers Markets. Just for some housekeeping issues, down typically at the bottom right-hand side or along the right-hand side of your screen, you will see lots of options during this webinar. There is a chat box and a place to ask questions. If you have questions for us, please type in that question. I'll try to keep track of it, and we'll get to these questions after all of our presenters have presented.
Good afternoon, everyone, and hello from Athens, Georgia. My talk will focus on the updates on the H-2A Foreign Farm Worker Visa Program during the pandemic period. Before we go to that, let me first give you a brief background on overall patterns of labor use. I want to clarify some patterns of labor use in the U.S. farm sector, giving you an overview of what the overall conditions are right now. First, it's a given fact that the farm industry is a labor-intensive industry or sector. There's farm labor expenses would comprise about 40% of total operating expenses in certain industries, in certain enterprises. And it's been a known fact that for a long while, the farm sector has been very dependent on foreign labor inputs. There was a time when the farm sector was a major employer of undocumented immigrants. However, when stricter immigration policies were implemented and the undocumented workers were evicted, the farm sector looked to the domestic labor supply to see if domestic residents would be willing to fill in as alternative or replacement labor. Unfortunately, domestic residents have shown unwillingness to take on farm work. And for those who were able to, a few of them who showed up in the farm proved to be not as productive as the undocumented workers. So farmers look to the H-2A Farm Worker Visa Program as the only remaining legitimate option for hiring foreign labor or foreign workers. Unfortunately, the H-2A program has been regarded by most farms as a last resort hiring option, mainly because there have been some patronage issues revolving on regulation and implementation issues. On the regulation side, farmers thought that the H-2A program was very costly and also had cumbersome requirements. On the implementation side, the length of the processing of the foreign farm working visas did not actually, well, the issue was whether the processing would bring in workers promptly at the time when farms actually need them. Over time, the government has actually addressed more on the implementation issues by increasing efficiency in the processing of the H-2A visas. And so over time, and in more recent years, the H-2A program has actually started to supply a larger part of the the total workers hired in the farm sector. If we look at this this plots here and we just focus on the broken red lines, we see that just during the period 2013 to 2019, there was actually an increasing proportion of H-2A workers or H-2A visas to total hired workers in the farm sector. In 2013, the proportion was only 9.72%, but then in 2019, it jumped to 27.43%. During the recent pandemic, there's been a significant overall economic slowdown. In fact, we were talking about a recession, another recession, after we just experienced a big one in the late 2000s. The good news for the farm sector was that during this overall economic slowdown under pandemic conditions, the farm sector's demand has been sustained, mainly because the farm sector was supplying essential goods. In fact, there were reports that small local farms actually experienced increased sales when the restaurants closed. And when groceries experienced panic buying and stockpiling from its consumers, the farm sector was challenged to replenish supply. The consensus was that during this pandemic, the problem of the farm sector was not of demand, but disruptions in the supply chain. And labor was seen as a disrupting factor. So let's look at the hiring patterns during these COVID-19 conditions. The lockdown period, which was about from March to starting in March, actually coincided with the peak of the farm's labor needs. Around April would be the time when farms actually, most crops are actually being planted, and then harvest season would come in late spring and summer. So this would be around the time when workers are really needed. Unfortunately, it coincided with the lockdown. So let's look at what happened during this lockdown period in the trends in the H2A applications. And we're going to trace it according to the processing sequence. First, let's look at labor certification data. And this is the first step when a farmer is going to apply for an H2A visa. They go to the Department of Labor for foreign labor certification. And the trend over time would show that the peak of labor certification approvals would actually occur around the second quarter to the third quarter of each year. And this is actually a fiscal year, they work on a fiscal year basis. So the second to third quarters would be from the months from January to June. And in 2020, we actually, second quarter of 2020, the fiscal year 2020, actually registered the highest ever recorded number of foreign labor certifications for H2A purposes at 97,321. So certification-wise, the trend has been sustained. Let's look at the subsequent step, which is the visa approval, application and approval. In a fiscal year, the peak of the visa approvals with the Department of State would actually occur around April. And actually, this year was no exception, because in April we see a peak of visa approvals of 31,303 nation for all workers coming from all origins, with Mexico accounting for 96% of that total at 30,157 visas. So again, as far as visa approvals are concerned, the trend has been sustained. It has not been disrupted by the pandemic conditions. Why is this? Why is this so? Because there's been credit would go to the government's prompt adjustment in regulations. On March 20, the government suspended regular visa processing services in all consular offices, but made an exception for H2 visa processing. They granted interview waivers for returning and first-time applicants, as long as this would not have any ineligibility indicators. They also granted interview waivers for those who are renewing their visas that expired within the last 2 years. And then for those workers already here in the US, the US government granted this temporary final rule, which allowed farmers with approved labor certifications to hire immediately those workers if those workers are already here in the country. And to bolster that support would be the information sharing arrangement between the USDA, the US Department of Agriculture, and the Department of Labor. So if labor certification numbers are not affected and visa numbers are not affected, it would be the arrivals that would be questionable. Even if workers, H2A workers from other countries would have their visas, the question is, would they be able to enter the US? And we know that in February, the US started banning entries from China and Iran, and in March, they banned entries from most European countries. And focusing on the travel dynamics between US and Mexico, because Mexico is supplying majority of the H2A workers, we see that these two countries actually had a joint initiative on March 20, which banned non-essential travel. Fortunately, H2A related entries were actually considered essential travel. So if workers had H2A visas, they would be allowed into the country. The question is, will they be able to go through the heightened medical screenings at ports of entry? And we know that medical screenings have been really heightened. We were really very strict about that. To add to that, at the border, at the southwest border, there was a panic of some COVID-19 outbreaks. So I looked at some preliminary data because the data for the arrivals have not really been finalized yet. I looked at I-94 admissions. I-94 is the immigration document that would signify that somebody has entered the country. Based on March 2020 arrivals, there was a 30.1% decline versus March of last year records. And then for April, all I can access were the air arrivals data, and only 2,968 air arrivals were recorded in April 2020. And this represented about 99% drop from the April 2019 level. And the border crossings data have not been finalized yet, so I can only get unofficial estimates based on border apprehensions. And the indication was that border crossings were actually down by 80%. So the question is, if workers are delaying their travel plans or postponing their travel plans, how long will the delay be or the postponement would be? The reality is that the farms need the workers now during the planting season and the upcoming harvest season, which is coming up very, very soon. Would the farm be able to rely on the domestic labor pool? If we try to recall the lessons learned from the last recession, the answer probably would be no, because in the last recession, we see domestic workers actually really reluctant to take on farm jobs. And but here's a glimmer of hope. If we look at the recent unemployment trend, we see that in the past, agricultural unemployment rate was usually higher than non-agricultural unemployment rate. I had to correct that. But recently, the interesting thing was that in April and May this year, the farm sector registered unemployment rates of 9.6% in April and 6.5% in May, while the non-agricultural sector registered an unemployment rate of 15.6% in April and 14% in May. So the situation is reversed. There are now more unemployed people, unemployed domestic residents in the non-farm sector. So the question is that since we have more unemployed people in the non-farm sector, would that induce them to now endure farm work? Even farm work has always usually been avoided by them, this time for the sake of survival. As of now, I'm still collecting data, and I would be, that's something I'm really interested in validating.
Well, thank you very much, Cesar. And while we are transitioning to the next speaker, Dr. Lillian Brisland, don't forget to put your questions into the question box, and we will get to them later.
I'm muting myself. Welcome to Web Live. Hi, I'm Lillian Brislin. I'm at the University of Kentucky. So thankful to be with you all today. And I'm hoping you can see my screen. And thank you, Dr. Escalante, for that great presentation. H2A was top of mind for so many of our local producers at the start of the pandemic. So it's interesting to see that research coming out. What I'm going to talk about today is my work with the National Farm Institution Collaborative, and specifically the Metrics Collaborative. So a bit of changing gears and sort of a story of how our work has unfolded over the past year, and what we're doing now, how we've pivoted, and what future research looks like. So what you're going to learn from me is about our collaborative, and I'm going to debut. You're going to get to see a sneak peek of our farm impact metrics for local procurement, and then I'm going to talk about how this project's going to move forward and some other research that's happening. So our collaborative is 40 members across 20 states, all of us doing different kinds of farm institution work. It was spearheaded by Farm Institution New England, an amazing organization, love their work, and they have grown to build this other national collaborative, and we meet at a quarterly basis virtually. We share resources, we share war stories, tools and tricks, and out of the work of this collaborative, there was a recognition that across healthcare, across higher ed, farm to K through 12 corrections, all of us saw a need for harmonizing our metrics, the way that we measure and talk about what is local food, because it was causing a lot of confusion. And so out of that, we formed a cooperative agreement with USDA AMS. And so thankful for their support and leadership to take a first step down that road of creating harmonized metrics. And when I say metrics, I mean ways of measuring, categories, definitions that can be used for tracking and reporting for local food. And we're just starting with farm impact, and that's where AMS came in. How can we, let's take a first step down that road and see where we get. And once we had those metrics, our plan was to develop tools and protocols to help with the adoption and implementation of those metrics, and then a plan to road test them, to pilot them with some distributors or partners at institutions, and then share what we learned. Why would we want to do this? To overcome what we call the local trap. So the best thing about local is that you can define it any way you want, but from a metrics perspective, it's sort of the worst thing. It's really hard to measure, and I'm sure if you're economists in the virtual room, you can appreciate that. So if we can come up with harmonized metrics, we can have an apples to apples comparison, right? If I say that we had 20% majority farm impact products in our procurement, you know exactly what that means relative to your own. And when we have clear and consistent language, we are able to better benchmark ourselves against others. We're able to create good KPIs or key performance indicators in our contracts. We can set clear procurement policy at a municipal level, and even in, let's say, grant evaluation if you're coming from a USDA perspective. And once we do this, once we have the same language, we're talking about it consistently, we're working it into our supply chains for procurement, that helps us simplify the tracking and eases a lot of the barriers for farm institution procurement, because when I work with my distributor, when I work with my dining service provider, we know exactly what kind of products we want to bring in, we know exactly what kind of products are going to meet our goals and get us to where we want to be. And this isn't just me. I just really want to recognize that we pulled together a really incredible team of national leaders. This is at our first in-person meeting in Kentucky, from Farm Institution New England, Michigan State, Good Food Purchasing, Healthcare Without Harm, National Farm to School Network, California Health Improvement Partners, Real Food Generation, some really passionate and thoughtful and experienced folks who are working in this space of farm institution procurement, working with institutions to set goals and meet them, and some really great support from our partners at USDA, both FNS and AMS. So this is a joint product. We started in September of last year, and so just thankful to the work of all these folks and honored to present it on our behalf. Oh, so the big moment. This is what we came up with. Jeff O'Hara, is my colleague at AMS, said, initially I started this, I thought, oh, what could it take? We'll just come up with some metrics. And it took a bit of doing, right? A lot of these organizations have been building their definitions of what's local and how to track it for a while, and to get us all together took a few months, but it was a really insightful process and helped us drill down on what do we mean when we say local, right? How do we get beyond that local relativism trap? So we have this suite of metrics. Each one has categories within it. I don't have time to share them all today, unfortunately, but we can take a look. So business type tells us what kind of business or farm produced the final product. Is it a local independently owned business, or is it an affiliative or corporate subsidiary that's located within the local region? Ownership, is there a diversity, equity, inclusion part of your procurement? Are this minority or women-owned business? Farm impact, I'll show you the categories of this one, but does the local food item have ingredients from a local farm, which is a big difference in splitting between local foods that come from local farms and local foods that are just manufactured locally. Farm identity asks about the source identity, or is it source identity preserved? So do we know the farmer is a shorthand way for that. What kind of product is it, right? This lets us know if we're sourcing proteins or produce, and a bunch of other categories. And how did it get to the institution? What's the market channel that it came through? Was it a direct purchase from a farmer? Did it come through a food hub? Or did it come through a conventional distributor? Great. So this coding scheme and these metrics are intended to be applied at the item level. So a lot of my work here at the University of Kentucky is working with our dining partner in tracking and tracking their local purchases and making sure we meet our contractual KPIs. So if we have a case of carrots, you can imagine a virtual UPC scanner that will tell us ideally in the data stream, in the invoicing and procurement process, these attributes of the product. So all products have all of these attributes. And here's just one example. So for farm impact, which is one of our metrics categories, we're asking what percentage of the items and ingredients come from a farm or farms within the local region. And that local region is defined by the institution, right? We're not saying it has to be 100 miles or 200 miles or within the state. Local is determined by the region, but these specific categories are at least defined. The components of them are defined by these metrics. So is it 100% right? Maybe you added some salt to it, but is it all farm impact? Is it a majority of the ingredients were sourced from a local farm? Some of them were. Maybe you've got the broccoli in a broccoli soup that came from a local farm, or none of the ingredients. So each of those metrics you saw earlier breaks down along these lines. And from there, we built some tools, guides, and protocols to help walk people through what these metrics are, how you use them. We have an Excel sheet for folks who want to track their data in this way that has the categories pre-populated. Our colleague from Real Food Generation developed this beautiful step-by-step walk you through it guide that explains exactly how to find this information and how to code them. We have a couple very simple automatic totaling sheets. So if people want to get their feet wet in experimenting with these metrics and what it helps them see about their own local procurement, we have those ready to go and to be road tested. And we really see a lot of ways that this data could be useful. For my own institution, it was incredibly helpful even to make this first distinction between local foods that are only business impact, as in they have no locally procured ingredients, and items that are farm impact. So the pie chart on the left is all of our schools' food buy for all of campus dining, right? 73, these are made up numbers, but let's say 70% comes through the traditional supply chains and it's not local, and these other percentages, we can break them down that way. And then if we go a few steps further in doing some really pretty simple crosstabs, we could look at some cool stuff about what's happening in institutions. Again, this is all made up data. So let's say if we're interested in our local procurement initiatives, just substituting products that would have come through conventional value chains anyway. So we're substituting a geographically proximate commodity chicken for one that was somewhat further away, but in no way actually changing the nature of the value chains. So when we make this difference between source identified and non-source identified, we could start to look at, are we making new markets for source identified products through farm institution procurement? Questions I'd love to ask. And we can just look at change over time, right? So if we have a goal that we want to increase our local produce purchasing 3% every year, when we put these metrics in place in an institution, we could look at change over time relative to whatever values or whatever goals that institution sets. So we have these available. or they're about to be available. We have a website that explains a lot of what we're working on. You can see the full metrics. It should be up next week. We were working on a deadline, but we had some final tweaking to do. But if you want to check out FTI metrics at localfoodeconomics.com, Local Food Economics has some great resources, and we're just continuing to build on that platform. So please check it out and check back in regularly. You can join our mailing list and get updates. So we were all ready, right? We had our metrics, we have our tools, we're getting out the gate. And then COVID came, and our next step in the process was going to be to reach out to distributors and institutions to get them to pilot these metrics. But cafeterias shut down. We were just finishing up at the National Good Food Networks conference, really excited with all the feedback we got, and I came back to Kentucky and we started the process of shutting campus down. So we had my farmers with product in the field that was all ready to come to campus that we weren't sure how we were going to find markets for it. We had some of our food hubs and distributors that were holding inventory that was ready to go to restaurants and institutions that then had nowhere to go. Our K through 12 colleagues just had a massive pivot to try to figure out how to continue to feed America's children. And we have these persisting questions about what the fall is going to look like. I know we're all trying to be optimistic and put as many contingency plans in place, but how will the continued uncertainty of what institutional dining looks like impact the work that so many of us have been working to build these value chains for so many years? So as a collaborative, we came together and said, should we just put a pause on this sort of indefinitely until things get back to normal? And we decided to keep moving forward, at least in refining and putting the metrics out there in the hope that by having clear definitions of what local procurement is, or clear ways, consistent ways to track it across institutions, we might then be able to do more robust research of what a pre and post-COVID farm institution world looks like. And then came another cooperative agreement. So I'm really honored to continue to work with AMS to look at local food systems at the time of COVID. We're looking at impacts and adaptations. It's a big project. 3 university teams, Colorado State, Penn State, and University of Kentucky is the lead. We've got 16 partner organizations on the ground, and we're looking to enhance and support their work as they support their stakeholder networks in adapting and learning about how COVID's impacting local food systems and how we can ensure their viability moving forward. So we've got direct marketing, non-commodity, wholesaling, farm institution, retail, and this is a special look at diversity, equity, inclusion. How are Indigenous people and historically underserved communities being impacted within local food systems, and how can we support continued resilience? And what we're going to do with that, there's a lot of stuff coming. We're just getting off the ground, but we'll have a resource hub also on that Local Food Economics website that'll have a COVID clearinghouse from the great work this is coming out of not only those organizations, but educational products out of our projects, such as these innovation briefs or little lightning studies, how-to documents from the cool innovations that stakeholders on the ground are putting in place. And we're going to move towards some deeper cross-sector case studies to think about how COVID has restructured some of the key elements of local food systems and what does that mean for the future. And even a consumer survey to look at how COVID is shifting attitudes and purchasing behaviors around COVID. So there's a lot coming. More to come. Our resource hub should be up soon. I'm sure we can get it out to the listserv. And it's a whirlwind, and we're still learning. So with that, I hope this is a natural transition over to my colleague, Ben Feldman, who's actually one of our amazing partners in that COVID research product. And thank you so much.
And as we transfer the screen to Ben, don't forget to type your questions in the question box. And take it away, Ben.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the opportunity to be here today talking about the impacts of coronavirus on farmers markets. Obviously, a significant issue for so many of our members. Just quickly, a little bit about the Farmers Market Coalition. I am our executive director. Our mission at the Farmers Market Coalition is to strengthen farmers markets for the benefit of farmers, consumers, and communities. We are a 501c3 nonprofit with membership in all 50 states, Puerto Rico, and Canada. And when we talk about our work, our primary stakeholder group is that of the farmers market operator. So even as we work towards benefits for farmers, consumers, and communities, when we talk about strengthening farmers markets, the think about farmers market operators, and this is worth spending just a minute on because it'll come up again in my presentation a couple times. So these are the organizations and individuals that do the work to plan, host, and manage farmers markets. This is an important role and one that often goes unseen even among individuals who shop farmers markets regularly or otherwise are familiar with local foods. When people think of farmers markets, they immediately think of farmers. They often think of the consumers and community impacts, but it's important to keep in mind that at the heart of every successful farmers market is a farmers market operator that is hustling, busting their tail in order to make sure that they're able to deliver on the goals and the mission of their farmers market. So with that in mind, FMC does our work falls into two main core functions. The first is supporting farmers market operators so that they can be more effective in their work. So this is resource development, training, technical assistance, and that type of work. And then we also consider our second work to be providing a voice for market operators to external stakeholders and decision makers. So for us, this includes our external work around promoting farmers markets, consumer advocacy, consumer education, as well as policy advocacy. So let's talk about farmers markets and coronavirus. So we sort of think of that at phase one, titled here as farmers markets are essential, could easily be called the big scramble. Early March, it became apparent that the impacts of coronavirus were going to be significant for our country and for farmers markets. This is happening at a time where markets in certain parts of the country, California, Southwest and Southeast, as well as winter markets in other parts of the country are going strong. And these markets moved very quickly to innovate and adapt in order to do their best to protect public health, even as the situation on the ground was changing day by day, market by market. And a patchwork of responsibility, as well as differing views by relevant agencies, definitely hampered the reopening and staying open of farmers markets during this process. So let's talk first about what farmers markets were doing, how they were innovating. So right off the bat, farmers markets moved incredibly quickly, and you can see here some examples, setting up hand washing stations or marking 6 feet distances within the farmers market in order to create lines that customers can know where to stand in order to appropriately distance. As things developed, we also saw other innovations. You can see here a drive-through market. It's a Hillsdale Farmers Market in Portland, Oregon. On the left side of the screen is the Holly Springs Farmers Market in North Carolina. If it's not clear in this picture, this market is normally a market with 2 rows of vendors with an aisle down the middle, and vendors one next to each other. What's happening in this picture is the vendors are all lined up along one side with basically a stall's worth of space, 10 feet of space in between the individual stalls in order to allow for physical distancing and protect public health. We've also got pre-order systems where you can see here at the Marin Civic Center, the farmers market in California. They're pre-boxing food from multiple farms into one box, which consumers have pre-ordered, and then they can just pick up and take away. On the right side, you can see the Columbia Farmers Market in Missouri, where they are engaging in crowd control efforts in order to make sure the markets are not overcrowded. And again, these are all efforts that have come from within the farmers markets and shared among farmers market operators through organizations like Farmers Market Coalition and State Farmers Market Association. The extent to which these markets moved quickly to innovate and adapt really reflects the versatility and the innovation that we see within farmers markets. And then we can move on to some of the challenges that markets faced in this situation, and starting with the fact that the federal government, while there is a federal indication of food and agriculture as essential businesses through the CDC. There's no specific mention of farmers markets, which was a huge challenge for market operators. Both the CDC as well as USDA were unwilling to issue any sort of specific guidance designating farmers markets as essential services, which left most of that entirely up to the states. As you can imagine, working with 50 different states has its challenges. And even when states designated farmers markets as essential services, local jurisdictions, in many cases, had their own process by which they approved farmers markets, in some cases on individual basis. And across the board, it was very inconsistent, making it very challenging for farmers markets in order to know what was necessary for them to be able to operate in accordance with guidance and regulations. So this is definitely an opportunity for learning. By and large, we're at a point where most states have issued guidance that farmers markets are essential services, and yet this work still continues. There are markets that are still struggling in order to understand what they need to do in order to open based on the guidance from county or city officials without any sort of specific guidance. So as you can see, most of this work to protect public health within the farmers market sector is really coming from farmers market operators, being shared among the industry, as I mentioned, through Farmers Market Coalition and our other partners. And it really demonstrates, again, the extent to which farmers market operators and the farmers who participate in it are incredibly good at innovating. They are definitely a group that is able to move nimbly and quickly to address challenges. So now we're starting to move into what might be considered the new normal. Many markets that delayed opening in hopes that the virus or might pass. It's obviously become clear that that is not going to happen anytime soon. So markets are really starting to look at both what are the impacts longer term, as well as what are the systems that are going to be most effective for this going forward. Many of the systems that were put in place initially are being considered and reconsidered given everything that we know now. The impacts are definitely widespread within the farmers market and direct to consumer industry, and they're quite varied. And some of that's based on the different parts of the country. It has to do with market operators and how they function, and other factors at play. So let's talk about those impacts a little bit. So we're certainly seeing spikes in interest and sales in local food. Direct to consumer sales are up in many parts of the country as consumers responded to supply chain challenges in other outlets. Farmers markets and direct to consumer retailers definitely are better positioned to avoid those types of disruptions given the short supply chain nature of farmers markets and other direct outlets. Unfortunately, other parts of the country are certainly seeing declines. We did just hear from one of our partners in North Carolina that 64% of their farmers report a decline in sales at farmers markets. And even in places where there is an increase in sales, many farmers are taking on additional costs in order to meet demand. And this may be because of labor challenges, as has already been talked about, and then also PPE and a range of costs and challenges that they are incurring. And coming back to farmers market operators are certainly facing both increased costs and decreased revenue. A recent survey that we did of our membership indicated that 93% are facing increased costs, and these costs come in the form of increased labor costs. I showed you a slide where a farmer's market is conducting crowd control in order to limit the number of customers in the market. Doing so typically for a market requires limiting the number of entrances and exits to the market and having staff at those locations, which is not standard practice in non-coronavirus times. Markets need protective equipment for their staff as well as other market staff. Many cases, they're renting additional equipment or adding additional services, either to provide hand washing stations, crowd control, or these digital platforms in order to allow pre-ordering or online ordering. And then the decline in revenue, again, gets back to the way farmers market operators work and the way in which these organizations are structured. Typically, a farmers market, potentially their only source of revenue, but often their most significant source of revenue is a modest stall fee that they charge to their vendors to participate in the market. And attendance at farmers markets across the board by vendors is down. We're seeing this because vendors or farmers may have their own health considerations that are limiting their ability to participate in the market. They may be facing labor shortages again. And as one of the examples showed, the need to space vendors further apart. If the market does not have access to additional physical space, they are limited in the number of vendors that they can have. So a farmer's market that may have had 60 vendors, if they have to space them out 10 feet apart, means they can only have 30 vendors. So quite simple. Quite simply, farmers market operators are definitely facing increased costs in order to do business, which is threatening their ability to remain viable, to stay open, and to support the livelihood of farmers. So just as the takeaways here, farmers markets are absolutely resilient. Again, didn't see those types of supply chain disruptions. They're extremely adaptable. They move very quickly to protect public health, and the data that we have between the changes market operators have made, plus the outdoor nature of the markets, indicates that farmers markets are potentially one of the safest places to be shopping. The impacts are, as is typically the case when we talk about farmers markets at the national level, impacts are uneven. It's very difficult to speak about farmers markets at the national level with absolute uniformity. Farmers market operators are facing significant challenges in order to remain in business and continue to provide an outlet for farmers and a resource for community members. And we have need for additional congressional action in order to support the farm direct community here, considering the impacts of coronavirus. And I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you all today. And I guess at this point, we can go ahead and open it up for questions.
Thank you very much, everyone, for those great presentations. We do have a few moments for questions, and our panelists, you can probably see those all in the chat box. But let's start with, given current unemployment benefits, what would be the motivations for unemployed Americans to look for work in the agricultural sector? Do any of our panelists want to take that one on?
I can try to answer that. You see, the situation right now has changed a little bit. At the time when the farm sector was depending a lot on the undocumented workers, farm wages were low because the the undocumented workers were being paid at low wages. But with the resurgence, with the popularity of the H-2A program, the H-2A program has actually set a minimum wage, which is the adverse effect wage rate, which is really something that has been judged or ascertained as something that's fair. Then farm wages have been going up now. In fact, the gap between non-farm wages and farm wages have already narrowed.
So Cesar, I'm going to follow up with another question, if you can answer this one quickly. What's the ratio of H-2A visa holders to estimated undocumented laborers in the agricultural sector?
You want me to? I cannot get any more the number of undocumented workers, because as I said, they were slowly deported, the numbers have been going down. But I believe that they're still, I probably will get in trouble if I say they're still being employed right now, but the feeling is that there's still some employment going on in that area, but I don't have the number right now. But H2A workers have been taking over a large part of the total hired farm workers in the country.
Thank you. And this one's for Ben. Can your work address the spoilage of bulk products when the supply chain broke down? Though that, for example, it would be dumping milk, chicken, or beer products due to restaurant closures due to COVID-19. There's an irony in food disposed of, yet at the same time, people were scared of going without food.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned that from the farmers markets and other direct retail supply chain that can be applied here. For example, there was some of the examples around food that was dumped was food that had been, bulk prepared for restaurant delivery. And so those types of challenges we don't see as much in farm direct. It's much easier for a farmer to pivot from a sale to one channel to another in our systems because they're not special packed for that type of environment. And again, the flexibility afforded by direct market supply chains really means that the farmers can pivot quickly. Obviously, there are challenges and there are, again, as we've talked about, increased costs, but there are certainly opportunities here to think about the resilience of short supply chains, farmers markets, and other direct-to-consumer outlets when it comes to ensuring that at the same time farmers are concerned about dumping food and people are worried about having enough food to eat, that we can learn from that in order to make those connections.
Thank you. And Ben, this one's for you as well. You mentioned pre-orders from farmers markets. Is there any data on producers switching to order and delivery options? This individual has heard that CSAs have had an increase in demand in the last few months.
Yeah, absolutely. Certainly, we've heard a lot of indications, both anecdotally and some preliminary data around the increase in demand for CSAs. Some of this is around the fact that a CSA is a touchless exchange. As far as specific data, this illustrates both a challenge that we have within the farmers market sector as a whole and also challenges right now related to coronavirus, and that is I don't have access to that data. I don't know that we have it yet. Farmers market industry as a whole, we generally would like to see quite a bit more data, and that's part of why we're so excited to be part of this project with University of Kentucky and Dr. Brislin in order to make sure that we are able to collect and track those types of information.
Well, thank you for that. And there is a resource that for Lillian, and the comment says, if mapping COVID-19 projects alongside food systems projects can help, there's a next step in a map, and that's from kumu.io, the DigLife team, and maybe we can share that that as well. So I want to thank our presenters, Dr. Cesar Escalante, Dr. Lillian Brislin, and Ben Feldman. I'm Dr. Jane Kolodinsky, your moderator, and this webinar has been brought to you by CFAIR, the Council on Food, Agricultural, and Resource Economics, the Agricultural and Applied Economics Association, the Northeast Agricultural and Resource Economics Association, and USDA. And just to let you know, we want to let you know about our next program. It's not a webinar. We're going to be hosting a virtual panel discussion for graduate students and early career agricultural economists who are interested in meeting and communicating with members of the legislature and their staffers. We haven't picked the exact time, but follow us on Twitter and Facebook. And we also have a YouTube channel where you can see all of our webinars. Just search our full name, the Council on Food, Agricultural, and Resource Economics, or go to our website, cfair.org, and click webinars. Thank you again, audience, for listening in on today's webinar, and we look forward to you joining the next CFAIR event. Thank you, everyone.